You know this story, I know this story. Even if you've never opened a Bible, you know it. The lone shepherd boy versus the unbeatable giant. The small, scrappy underdog armed with nothing but a sling in his convictions, standing against a 9-foot-tall, fully armored killing machine. It's the ultimate tale of courage against impossible odds. It's a story so powerful, it's become a metaphor for every struggle we face, from a personal battle to a startup taking on a corporate giant. It's the story of faith, of divine favor, of good triumphing over evil. It's an amazing story, inspiring even. It feels true, doesn't it? But what if the story you know is a carefully constructed lie? What if I told you that it's not just historically a mess, but that the entire narrative is propped up by one single catastrophic logical flaw? A flaw so fundamental that once you see it, the whole legend crumbles into dust. So that's a pretty big claim, I know, to call one of the most beloved stories in the world a lie. But here's the thing. The problem with the David and Goliath myth isn't just that it's bad history, and trust me, we're going to see just how terrible the history is. No, the real problem is that the entire narrative is built like a house of cards on top of one catastrophic logical flaw. And in this video, we're going to pull that card out from the bottom and watch the whole thing come down. Here's how we'll do it. First, we're going to look at the official account and see how the story is literally at war with itself. Then we'll zoom out and see how it's really just a recycled hero trope that the ancient Israelites borrowed to build up their national mythology. And then, after all that, I'm going to show you the one simple, fatal piece of circular reasoning that holds the whole fragile thing together. Because when you actually read the text, and I mean really read it, the story starts to fall apart at the seams. It's so riddled with contradictions and details that make no sense. It's honestly amazing it ever got passed off as a divinely inspired record. Therefore, before we can even get to the big logical error that ruins the myth, we have to first sift through the wreckage and see that the history itself is a complete mess. Let's start with the most basic question. Who actually killed Goliath? Easy, right? In 1 Samuel chapter 17, the story we all know, it's David, our heroic shepherd boy. Case closed. Not so fast. If you keep reading and jump over to 2 Samuel chapter 21, the book gives credit to a completely different guy. It says, and I quote, Elhanan killed Goliath of Gath. Whoops, that's a pretty big detail to get wrong, isn't it? It's so awkward that much later, the writers of 1 Chronicles tried to perform a literary cleanup job, a retcon. They rewrote the line to say that Elhanan killed Goliath's brother. Nice try. You can literally see the editors centuries later trying to patch the holes in their own lore. Okay, problem number 2. How big was this so-called giant anyway? Well, that depends entirely on which manuscript you're reading. The much later Hebrew version, the Masoretic text, says he was 6 cubits and a span. Do the math, that's 9 feet, 9 inches tall. A true monster out of a fantasy novel. But if you look at the older texts, like the Greek Septuagint or the Dead Sea Scrolls, he was 4 cubits in a span. That's 6 foot 9 inches. I mean, still a big dude. You're not going to want to get in a fight with him, but he goes from being a literal impossible monster to an NBA center. It fundamentally changes the story. But my absolute favorite contradiction, the one that really shows you we're in the land of make-believe, is King Saul's bizarre case of amnesia. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, the chapter right before the big fight, the David character's already working for King Saul. He's the king's personal musician, playing the harp to soothe him, and he's even his armor bearer. Saul loves the kid. They know each other very well. But then, in the very next chapter, when this same kid shows up to fight Goliath, Saul turns to his general and asks who he is. He has no idea who this guy is. It makes absolutely zero sense. It's like your boss asking your name after you've been sitting in his office playing the harp for a year. It's sloppy storytelling. So the book can't decide who the hero is, how big the villain is, or if the main characters have even met before. This isn't a unified, divinely inspired account. It's a patchwork. You can see the different authors stitching together their favorite legends. Therefore, we have to conclude we're not reading a history book. We're reading a rough draft of a national myth that got edited and fixed over centuries. And frankly, they didn't do a very good job. But it gets so much worse, because when you zoom out from the sloppy text itself, you realize the authors weren't just messy, they were borrowing heavily. This whole clever underdog versus the big dumb monster story, it is a tale as old as time. It's one of the most common mythological tropes on the planet. Hercules, Gilgamesh, Theseus, the list goes on and on. Every ancient culture has a story like this. The character of David isn't a unique historical figure here. He's just the starring hero in the Israelite version of the story that was already ancient when their scribes wrote it down. And because they were writing a myth, not history, they got the details of the time period completely wrong. These are called anachronisms, and this story is packed with them. For instance, after the big fight, the text says the David character takes Goliath's head and parades it around Jerusalem. Sounds very heroic. Just one tiny problem. At the time this story is supposedly set, Jerusalem was a Jebusite fortress. The Israelites didn't control it. And who, according to the Bible itself, is the one who eventually conquers Jerusalem years later? A grown-up King David. It's a historical impossibility. It's like writing a story about George Washington taking a selfie in front of the Lincoln Memorial. The timeline just doesn't work. Oh, and Goliath's armor? The text describes it in loving detail. A bronze helmet, a coat of mail, bronze greaves on his legs. The thing is, that description sounds a whole lot more like the gear of a 5th century Greek hoplite soldier than anything an Iron Age Philistine warrior would have actually worn. Now, defenders of the story will sometimes desperately point to flimsy archaeological finds. They'll say, well, we found a pottery shard in the ruins of Gath with a name on it that's kinda, sorta, phonetically similar to Goliath. Okay, and? That proves nothing. This is what I call the Rostam argument. The stories of Rostam in the Shahnameh are set in real places that still exist today, like Zabal and the plains of Iran. The main character has a perfectly plausible name for that time and culture, Rostam. Now, if archaeologists digging up ancient ruins in Sistan and found an inscription mentioning a man named Rostam, would that prove he fought a white demon in Mazandaran or battled the dragon with his bare hands? Of course not. Getting a few background details right doesn't make the fantastic claims of the story true. So what are we left with? A story built on a recycled mythological trope, filled with historical errors and supported by zero credible evidence. Therefore, what we're looking at here isn't the historical event, it's a piece of political fan fiction. It's a nation-building propaganda designed from the ground up to glorify the legendary founder of their royal dynasty, this David character, and make him seem like a larger-than-life hero chosen by God. But that brings up the most important question of all. How does a myth like this actually work? How does it convince you of its central supernatural claim? What is the logical engine that makes the whole thing run? Well, now we've arrived at the heart of it. The payoff promised in the title of this video. The one single fatal flaw that holds this house of cards together. It has a name. Circular reasoning. Let me show you how it works. It's beautifully simple and completely hollow. The entire point of the David and Goliath story, the core theological claim that gives it meaning, is this. That's the premise. It's an assertion of divine, supernatural intervention. Now, as a rational person, your immediate follow-up question has to be, okay, prove it. What is your evidence that God intervened? And the story has only one answer. The text provides only one piece of evidence for its claim. And it's this. We know God gave him the victory because David defeated Goliath. Do you see it? The argument chases its own tail. Why did the David character win? Because God was on his side. And how do we know God was on his side? Well, because he won, obviously. The conclusion is just a restatement of the premise. It's a self-contained loop that requires zero external evidence. It proves absolutely nothing. You can use this bankrupt logic to justify anything. My lucky rabbit's foot helped me pass the test. How do you know it helped? Because I passed the test. It's the exact same fallacy. This is what makes the claim completely unfalsifiable. The story is the only evidence for the story. It's a closed loop, a logical black hole. And this is the broken engine at the very heart of the David and Goliath myth. It isn't powered by history or evidence or reason. It's powered by a single sentence pointing back at itself forever. Therefore, to keep the myth alive and useful in the modern world, believers have to deploy a whole toolkit of other logical fallacies to patch the holes and shield it from criticism. I call this the fallacy chain. First up in the chain, you've got a classic, good old-fashioned cherry picking. Think about the version of this story you hear in Sunday school or from a televangelist. It's always about the meek shepherd's boy's simple, innocent faith. They conveniently forget to mention the other Bible passage that says some guy named Elhanan might have killed Goliath. They definitely skip over the gruesome R-rated scene where the David character brutally beheads the giant and parades his head around as a war trophy. They pick the sweet, faith-promoting parts and toss the rest. It's not the whole story. It's a curated, sanitized highlight reel. But my absolute favorite fallacy, the one you'll hear from 1,000 pulpits, is the false analogy. That mountain of student debt you're buried under, that's your Goliath. That crippling anxiety you struggle with every day, that's your Goliath. And if God could help a little shepherd boy defeat a literal giant, then he can help you defeat your giants too. It sounds inspiring, but it's a logically bankrupt analogy. Why? Because in the myth, the Goliath character is a military obstacle to a nation's conquest, something the war god of the Old Testament supposedly cared a lot about. That same God, in that same book, has basically nothing useful to say about your complex mental health issues, other than maybe you have a demon or you should just try not to be anxious. Comparing a brutal mythological war story to your actual real-world nuanced problems isn't just unhelpful, it's intellectually lazy. And finally, when you back the defenders of the story into a corner, when you bring up the ugly stuff, the glorified violence, the execution, the trophy taking, they pull out the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card, special pleading. Yes, normally beheading a defeated enemy and parading his head around is a barbaric war crime, but this was a different time. Yes, normally we teach our kids not to solve problems with violence, but the Philistines were evil, so they deserved it. Yes, normally we'd call this morally questionable, but God himself ordered it, so who are you to judge? See how that works? It's creating a special protected bubble around your guy and your story. The moral rules that apply to everyone else on the planet are magically suspended just this once. Because, well, just because. It's the ultimate logical cop-out when your hero's actions are indefensible. So let's just recap the journey we've been on. We started with a story that everyone thinks they know, the ultimate tale of the underdog, the shepherd boy who became a hero. But when we looked closer at the text itself, we saw that the history was a complete mess, a patchwork of contradictions that can't even keep its own basic facts straight. Therefore, we had to look for another explanation, and we found one right away. It's not history. It's a recycled mythological trope, a classic piece of political propaganda designed to build up a foundational king for a nation. But for propaganda to work, it needs a persuasive engine, and we found that too. The single, fatal flaw of circular reasoning, an empty argument that proves absolutely nothing because it just chases its own tail. And therefore, to protect that broken engine from scrutiny, a whole chain of other fallacies has to be deployed to keep the story alive and inspiring in the modern day. So you see, the story of David and Goliath isn't really a story about faith beating the odds. It's a story about how a nation builds a hero myth. It's a perfect case study in how to construct a narrative that feels true, even when it's logically and historically bankrupt. A myth so poorly constructed that it contradicts itself, and so logically weak that it relies on a simple circular argument just to function. Therefore, and this is the whole point, the real giant in this story isn't Goliath. The real giant is the unexamined belief that stories like this must be true, just because they're old, powerful, and make us feel good. And the only slingshot you need to take that giant down is critical thinking. Look, the goal here isn't just to tear down one old story. It's about building up a skill, the skill of taking apart the narratives we're handed, whether they're ancient myths or modern news headlines, and seeing how they actually work. It's the most important tool you can have. As always, thank you so much for spending your time with me today. It means a lot. I'm Farid. Until then, keep thinking.